Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I'm so glad we're all here this week and not last week. And thank you very much. I'm very impressed with what you said. And as I said to you, it's the same story and you have heard it. I'm here today. Well, I would also like to thank Mr. Stanton because I have been here several times and it's always very reassuring when you're invited back to the school. I'm here today because I'm a survivor of the Holocaust. I am a survivor, but only just. Because I was born in a concentration camp right at the very end of the Second World War. But that comes right at the very end of my story. And I start my story with this map you can see on the screen. This is a map that shows all the main concentration camps and death camps that existed in Nazi-occupied Europe during the Second World War. It doesn't show all the camps by any means. It does show all the death camps, the red ones. Everywhere where you see the swastika, the Nazi emblem, there you see a name, and that name indicates either a slave labor camp, a transit camp, a concentration camp, or a death camp. And the three camps that my family were involved with are the three names that you can see in boxes. The first one is called Theresienstadt. That is the German word for a town in the country that used to be called Czechoslovakia and is now called the Czech Republic. It means the town of Teresa. It was named after a former empress of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Maria Theresa. But when I talk about it, I tend to use its Czech name, simply because my mother was Czech and it's less of a mouthful. The Czech word is Terezí. The second place you will have all heard of, that is the Auschwitz-Birkenau death camp in Poland. But the third one, Mauthausen, well, I usually say I very much doubt whether you've heard of, but what I can say about St. Thomas More is the fact that this is the only school, and I go to many, this is the only school I have ever come across that regularly takes students to Mauthausen, and for that I'm deeply grateful. And you were there in February, you said? Yeah. Now there's a second reason why I use this particular map, and that is to bring to your attention the inset in the circle in the top left-hand corner, where you can see a map of part of the British Isles. And there you can also see a swastika. The swastika is over the Channel Islands, over Jersey and Guernsey and Alderney, because they were invaded by the Germans. There were Jewish people living there, and they were either imprisoned on the islands or they were sent to concentration camps in Europe. So that shows you how closely the whole thing came to mainland Britain. Now, because I'm telling you a family story, it comes naturally to me to show you family photographs. And this is a photograph of my German family. My father was German, German but Jewish. It has an interesting place and date. It is Berlin in 1913, so just 1 year before the start of the First World War. And I'm sure you're all well aware of what we are coming to the end of commemorating, the end of that war. Whoops. What have I done? Yeah, I understand this was a family gathering in the summertime, and up to December of 2013, there was one person still alive from that photograph, and that was the little girl being held in her mother's arms on the left. Her name was Carla, and that year she did die, but she had reached the venerable age of 100. Now, the people you're going to see highlighted from that same photograph, the adults in the background are my grandparents with their 3 children in the foreground, and my father is the little boy on the right-hand side. Now in 1933, when Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany, all those 3 children by then were grown up. They were all grown up and they all realized that it would be advisable if they could get out of Germany. And the first one to leave was my Uncle Rolf. He left Germany and first he went to live in Holland, where he met and married a Dutch lady who was also Jewish. And when the Germans invaded Holland, they managed to escape to Switzerland, Switzerland being a neutral country during the Second World War. And then my uncle joined this particular army. And I want you to tell me what nationality the uniform is. Have a guess. Doesn't matter if you're wrong. Have a guess.
American.
Yes, American Army uniform. And after the war, my uncle was very proud of this photograph. He would say to us, look at me in GI uniform in front of, in quotes, my Jeep. So they would say. My father's sister, Marga, She and her husband and my cousin, they left Germany quite late, in December of 1938, but nevertheless they still managed to get on a ship that was headed for Sydney in Australia, so they were safe. My cousin was about 5 years of age at the time, but I don't happen to have a photograph of him at that age. Here I think he's graduating from medical studies at Sydney University, and he is now in his 80s. My own father, he left Germany in 1933, and he came to live in Prague, the capital of Czechoslovakia. He thought that was far enough to be safe. It wasn't, but if he hadn't come to Prague, he wouldn't have met my mother, and I would not be standing in front of you today. Now, I like to think of this as being my star photograph. I hope you might agree with me by the time you've seen them all. This is a photograph of my parents on their wedding day. They were married on the 15th of May 1940, which was already under Nazi occupation of Czechoslovakia. My father had been an architect and interior designer, and when he first came to Prague, he managed to get a job working for a furniture manufacturer, and initially he was employed to build film sets at the Brandov Film Studios, which are still there. My mother had been a law student at the university, but when the Germans invaded, they closed all the Czech universities and nobody was allowed to study. So she decided she was going to try to find a job that had more sort of immediate practical use. And she decided to become apprentice to a milliner. I don't want the more mature members of the audience to answer. Younger members of the audience, do any of you know what a milliner is? Not many people do nowadays, younger people. No? Okay, so more mature members of the audience, what's a milliner? Yes, I guess. Now you may think that wasn't a very sensible idea to learn how to make hats, but I can assure you that in the 1940s women always wore hats, even if they just went down to the local shops, they'd be sort of properly turned out. And it was the same in this country as well. Now when the Germans invaded any country, they immediately imposed various rules and regulations upon Jewish people. And they all come under the general heading of the Nuremberg laws, and there are hundreds of them. You may have seen some already displayed on the display in the hall. First and foremost, Jewish people immediately lost their citizenship. They were no longer allowed to vote. No intermarriage was allowed between Jewish people and those of other faiths. Jewish children were immediately expelled from mainstream schools. They had to go to special schools. Jewish people were no longer allowed to go shopping anytime they liked. They were only allowed to go at certain times of the day, invariably the late afternoon, when there would have been as little fresh produce available as possible. There was curfew. Jews were not allowed to go out in the evening. They also, in Prague there are trams, and Jews were only allowed to go on the outside bit, not inside, undercover. Jewish people were no longer allowed to keep animals. They had to hand them in. They no longer were allowed to keep their cars or their bicycles. They were no longer allowed to keep their telephones or their radios. There were no televisions. They were also forbidden to go to parks, cinemas, theatres, swimming pools. All those things were forbidden. Their lives were meant to be more and more restricted within their own communities. But because none of these restrictions in itself, at least initially, was life-threatening, people tended to think, well, if this is the worst it's going to get, we can cope with this, we can live with this. But by the same token, sometimes some people would test these restrictions. It's a very, especially young people, I want to say, it's a very common human reaction. If you are told you're forbidden to do something, well, I would say your gut reaction is to go and do it. Whether you actually do is another matter. And one day my mother decided she was going to go to the cinema despite the fact that it was forbidden. She was sitting in the cinema watching the film when the Gestapo came in, the secret police. They came in, they stopped the film, and they started to go through the audience, row by row, looking at their ID papers. And my mother was terrified because she had no idea how they would react when they got to her and when they saw the large J for Jew on her papers. And they got to about halfway through the auditorium, and they stopped, but they left the cinema. And they had stopped just one row in front of where my mother had been sitting. And boy, did she breathe a sigh of relief. And ever since she told me about this, I was always trying to get her to remember what on earth the film was that made her take such a risk. She also would have dearly liked to know what it was, but it was such a frightening experience, and it was the first. Far worse was to come, but she didn't know that. It was such a frightening experience that she obviously blanked out that memory, and she never remembered. But what I can tell you is that when we first came to this country, and when I was safely in school trying to learn English as quickly as possible, I think my mother used to go to the cinema every single day. And that was fantastic light relief for her after her wartime experiences. She just had this need, it was almost like an obsession, to catch up with the frivolous things of life. Now, one of the later restrictions that I imagine you are familiar with was the fact that Jewish people had to wear a yellow star. And although this is quite a dark photograph, you can see the stars just about on their coats. This is a photograph of my mother's older sisters, Dena and a friend. And I have a genuine yellow star to show you. This is a genuine yellow star. It has the word Jude on it, which means Jew in German. And everybody in a family had to wear the yellow star every time they went outside their own front door. You had to buy as many yellow stars as there were members of the family aged 6 and above. And my mother distinctly remembered what she was wearing the first time she ever had to wear one of these. She was wearing a dark green skirt, a tan suede jacket, hat, gloves, and she was going to the shops. She said it actually didn't look that bad on the suede jacket, but nevertheless she was very, very apprehensive. She was very worried as to how people might react to her. But every time my mother went outside wearing the yellow star, nothing ever happened to her. People just ignored it, and that was the best possible news. Nobody pointed at her, nobody laughed at her, nobody was rude to her, nobody spat at her. All those things happened to other people, but it never happened to my mother. We speculated as to why not, and all she could think was, she was a young woman, she was full of self-confidence, and she wasn't going to be cowed, she wasn't going to be bullied by anybody. And I think the fact that she wasn't a bad looker must have helped. But that first day when she went outside wearing it, she met a friend of hers also wearing one for the first time. But this friend was very unhappy and very ashamed of having to wear it. And this lady was walking down the road and she was sort of bent over double because she was trying to hide it. And my mother went up to her and basically gave her a pep talk and said to her, stand up straight, be proud to be Jewish, don't let the bastards get you down. And that was very much my mother's attitude, which helped her enormously. Now there's a second reason why I use this particular photograph, and that is simply to show you that they are smiling. They are smiling because they were out for a walk, obviously before curfew. Did I mention a curfew? They were engaged to be married, they were happy, and I assume at the instant that the photograph was taken, they had forgotten that they were wearing the yellow star with any implication that it might have for them in the future. And very fortunately for them, they had absolutely no idea what was to come. And I will tell you about them later. My mother had another sister, and her name was Ruja. Ruja means rose. And this is my Aunt Rose with my cousin Peter when he was about 5. And the next photograph will show you Peter a bit older with a photograph of his father, my Uncle Tom. And what's the uniform? Sorry? British, yes, British Army uniform. And the reason for that is, in 1939, my uncle managed to escape from occupied Czechoslovakia. He got to this country, he joined the Free Forces. He also managed to get a visa for his wife and for his child, but tragically my aunt refused to come. And the reason she refused to come was because it was a very unhappy marriage. And she said to her husband, she said, no, we'll be fine. We'll stay with my parents, with her parents, my grandparents. And that was the attitude of an awful lot, I would say the majority of Jewish people in occupied countries. Because initially nobody had any idea whatsoever that they might be sent away anywhere, let alone to something called a slave labor camp, a concentration camp, or a death camp. They had no idea. They just thought if they kept a low profile, more or less stuck to those rules and regulations, they'd be okay. That is human nature. You hope for the best. Yes, some people escaped. Yes, some people were hidden, but they were by far in the minority. And again, I'll tell you what happened to them later on. Now, this next photograph is an aerial photograph of this place called Terezin or Theresienstadt. It is about 40 miles outside of Prague, and before the war it was a garrison town where Czech soldiers were stationed. But when the Germans invaded, the Czech army was disbanded, and the Germans turned this place into a ghetto and a concentration camp. And Jewish people from all over Europe were sent there in their thousands. And when I was growing up and I was asking my mother, how she was taken prisoner, because I had various images in my mind. I'd read the Diary of Anne Frank, I'd seen films, I'd seen documentaries. And I had this picture in my mind that perhaps in the middle of one night, 3 o'clock in the morning, there would have been soldiers banging on the doors, soldiers with guns and dogs dragging people out of their beds. And I said to her, is that what happened to you? And she said, no, nothing like that. She said, we received a card in the post. And the card said, on a certain day, at a certain time, we would have to report to a warehouse in Prague, near one of the mainline railway stations. And that's what happened. At the end of November, the beginning of December of 1941, my father was sent his card, and he left. You were told you could take a small suitcase, you were advised to take warm clothing. You were also advised to take a few pots and pans, which indicated to them that they were going somewhere where they would be able to cook, they'd be able to look after themselves, and they assumed that they were being sent to some sort of labour camp. And a few days later, my mother received her card and she left. And not only was she carrying her handbag and her suitcase, she was also carrying a large cardboard box. It was about that big, it was about that deep, and it was tied together with string. And I said to her, what on earth did you have in the box? Did you have enough to worry about, enough to carry? And she said, well, I think I had between 2 or 3 dozen donuts in the box. And I said, why donuts? And she said, well, your father liked donuts. And it was a very sensible thing to do, as she had no idea where the next meal was coming from, so she was bringing food. It just happened to be donuts. And I said to her, did they get to him? She said, yes, they weren't terribly fresh anymore, but they're perfectly edible. And he was pleased. Now, my mother had to spend 3 days and 3 nights in that warehouse with hundreds and hundreds of other people. They weren't given much food or water. They had to sleep on the floor. And at the end of those 3 days, they were marched to the railway station. And the route was lined with young German officers, 18, 20-year-olds. And there was one young German officer who knew he had a bit of power, and he wielded it. He didn't harm my mother physically. He was just a bit sarcastic with words. I know that you study German in this school. I will say what he said in German. I will then translate it. I apologize for the swear word, but it's what he said. This soldier could see that my mother was having great difficulty, not only with her luggage, but with carrying the boxes for donuts. Cake boxes haven't changed much since. They're still made of cardboard, although nowadays they'll be tied with ribbon or with string. And the moisture from the donuts after 3 days was making the cardboard soften. So the whole box was coming adrift, it was coming apart. And this soldier could see that she was having great difficulty with it, and he said to her, "Es ist scheißegal, ob die Schachtel mitkommt," which means, I couldn't give a ... if that box goes with you. Or not, implying that it wasn't going to do her much good where she was going. Now, he couldn't have had any idea whatsoever what was going to happen to her. All he knew was that it wasn't going to be anything good, and metaphorically speaking, he just wanted to twist the knife. But she ignored him, she got on the train, she arrives in Terezin. I'm now going to show you 2 drawings of Terezin because I think they are more evocative of the sort of place that it was at the time. These drawings were done secretly by professional artists who themselves were prisoners, and they were discovered after the end of the war, quite by chance. They were discovered buried under the floorboards and in cracks in the walls. And I use this particular one to try to give the impression of a very crowded place. Because before the war, when it was a Czech garrison town, there would have been a few thousand soldiers stationed there. But during the war, when it was a ghetto and a concentration camp, there were thousands and thousands and thousands of people cramped into very, very crowded conditions. And on the inside, it looked like this. People basically lived on bunks. They would try to make a niche, a den for themselves with a few personal belongings that they had been able to bring. And when families first arrived in Terezin, that is the first time that those families would have been split up. So men were sent to one part, women to another part, elderly people to another part, children to yet another part. They were able to meet up sometimes during the day, but to a large extent they led separate lives. And when my mother arrived in Terezín, she was fortunate enough to be given a job. Jobs weren't paid or anything, but life was a bit easier if you had a job. And her job was working for the man who had the responsibility for sharing out the food. There wasn't much food there, but what there was, they tried to share out in a fair fashion. And that meant that she had access to food. When I say she had access to food, she would steal. She would steal a potato, a carrot, a turnip, just something with which to make a more substantial soup. And that was literally of vital importance. Because at one time my mother had the responsibility every single day for trying to find food for 15 members of her close family. Every single day. That was her main worry. How on earth was she going to find enough food for all those people? And that was quite apart from the greater worry as to what on earth was going to happen to them all in the future. And amongst the people she was trying to find food for were her parents, my grandparents Ida and Stanislav. And the next picture shows my father as a young man with his mother Selma. And the next picture shows his father, my grandfather Louis. Now my grandfather Louis was the only one of my 4 grandparents to have survived the war. And we believe there is a specific reason for that, although we don't actually have any proof. I told you at the beginning that my father was German. His father was German. In the First World War, my grandfather was in the German army. In the First World War, my grandfather was given the Iron Cross First Class. That is the highest military honour that the Germans bestow upon their soldiers. And what happens to him in the Second World War? He's thrown into a concentration camp, and most of his family is killed. My grandfather was not sent east. To be sent east was a euphemism, another way of saying you're going to be sent to the Auschwitz-Birkenau death camp. He remained in Terezín throughout the war, and at the end of the war he was found to be alive, just about. And via the Red Cross, contact was made between him and my uncle and aunt, who by that stage had returned from Switzerland to Holland. And one day there was a knock on the door, and there was my grandfather in the rags that he stood up in, and he lived with them for the rest of his life. And when I was a little girl, we used to go and visit him quite often, and it was very sad, because I would come into the room and my grandfather couldn't see me, because he had been blinded by the gas in the First World War. And he couldn't speak to me, because he spoke German and Dutch, and I only spoke Czech and English. But nevertheless, I'd come into the room, I'd give him a kiss, I'd say, "Hello, grandfather." And he knew that I was the only surviving child in the family. Now, this next photograph is probably familiar to you, and I think there was another one on one of the displays. This is the gateway to the Auschwitz-Birkenau death camp in Poland. But before I start that part of the story, I have to tell you about 2 other things that happened to my parents in Terezín. To a large extent, Terezín was a transit camp for the death camps, because there were various categories of people who would have been sent to Auschwitz to their deaths quite quickly. And amongst those groups of people would have been the old, the sick, mothers of children, pregnant women, the mentally disabled, the physically disabled. They would have been sent to their deaths quite quickly. But because my parents were young, strong and well capable of work, so they remained in Terezín for 3 years. That was a remarkably long, very unusually long period of time. You know, just think back 3 years in your lives. It's a long time. And my mother said luck had an awful lot to do with it. But at the end of September of 1944, their luck ran out, because it was on that day that my father was sent to Auschwitz. And incredibly, my mother actually volunteered to follow him the very next day. And the reason she volunteered to follow him was because she had no idea where he'd been sent. And being the eternal optimist, she thought, well, as they had survived 3 years up to that point, she thought, well, nothing could get any worse. Little did she know. But she thought nothing could get any worse. They would survive. But in fact, she never, ever saw my father again. And she heard from an eyewitness, a friend, quite soon after the end of the war, that my father had actually been shot dead on a death march near Auschwitz on the 18th of January 1945. And Auschwitz was liberated by the Russian army on the 27th of January 1945. And that is why we commemorate Holocaust Memorial Day on the 27th of January. Now, the other thing I have to tell you about what happened to my parents in Terezin is really rather important, that I'm sure you would agree, because it concerns my conception and my brother's conception. I mentioned the fact that when families first came into Terezin, the sexes were segregated, men from women. Well, in 1943, my mother discovered that she was actually pregnant. And when I was, 12, 13, no doubt when it would have been at its most embarrassing, well, it's embarrassing at any age, I said to her, so how come you got pregnant? You weren't my father. And she replied in a very clever way. She said, well, it was very, very, very dangerous. But your father and I got together secretly, as and when we could, and to hell with the consequences. End of story. But it was not the end of the story, and it had very, very serious consequences. Because to become pregnant in a concentration camp was considered by the Nazis to be a crime punishable by death. Because they were trying to annihilate, they were trying to murder every single member of the Jewish race. They couldn't prevent women coming into the camps pregnant. But the reason for the segregation was so that they could not become pregnant while there. And when the Nazis discovered that my mother and 4 other women were also pregnant, they made these 5 couples sign a document that said that when the babies were born, they would have to be handed over, to be killed. Except they didn't use the word kill, they used the word euthanasia. My mother had never heard the word euthanasia. She had to go and ask somebody what it meant. If you look it up in a dictionary, it will say something like mercy killing. This would not have been mercy killing. This would have been murder. In the event the other 4 babies were born, we don't actually know what happened to those families. We think they all perished in Auschwitz. When my brother, Jerzy means George, he was born in February of 1944. He was not taken away from my parents, but he actually died of pneumonia 2 months later. And his death meant my life, which is a very strange thing to say. But my brother's death meant my life because had my mother arrived in the Auschwitz-Birkenau death camp holding my brother in her arms, she would have been sent straight to the gas chamber. But because she arrived in Auschwitz not holding my brother, and although she was pregnant again, this time with me, nobody knew. She knew, but nobody else knew, and it didn't show. So again, she lived to see another day. Now at this stage, I'd like to ask of you what images you might have in your minds. For example, have any of you seen either Schindler's List or The Pianist? Can you put up your hands, please? Great. When Schindler's List first came out, my mother was given a private showing of it with another survivor, and she was interviewed afterwards. She was interviewed countless times. And she was asked her opinion. Opinions vary. But in her opinion, she felt as though the scenes within the camp were, so true to life. She felt as though she'd been transported back to those days, those times, and those conditions. And when we came out of seeing The Pianist, which is also a film based on a real person, she was actually trembling. Now tell me, have any of you read or seen The Boy in the Striped Pyjamas? Right. Well, I think that was a good book and a good film, but there was a very, very big but. Absolutely nothing in the book or the film could have happened. None of the scenes within the camp, because it's based on a false premise. Because that little Jewish boy who was meant to be about 8 years of age, he would never have survived a death camp, more than a few hours. Because if you were under the age of, say, 12 or 13, and if you were not tall, and could give the impression of being capable of manual labour, you would have been sent straight to the gas chamber. He also would never have met the little German boy. But John Boyne, the author, he was not writing a historical document. He was writing a novel. He was writing fiction. And as such, it does have its place. But please always remember, it is not historical fact. Has anybody been to Auschwitz? You've probably seen images of how people were transported to the death camps. They were sent on trains, but these trains didn't consist of ordinary carriages. These trains consisted of cattle trucks that were so crowded that people couldn't even sit down. They had hardly any air. There might have been a slat open at the top, and that was all. They were given no food and no water, and sometimes these journeys took several days. There were no toilet facilities. There might have been a bucket, which would have been totally inadequate very quickly. So by the time the trains actually arrived in Auschwitz, invariably the people inside them would have been in a very poor mental and physical condition, especially the elderly and the children, because they had the least resistance, the least stamina. Auschwitz itself consisted of several different camps. Auschwitz I was brick-built, and that is where all the Polish prisoners were sent. And that is where today it is not only a place of memorial, but also a museum where you have the collections of luggage, the collections of shoes, the collections of hair, the collections of spectacles, the collections of pots and pans. All those things are in Auschwitz I. But this Auschwitz II, Auschwitz-Birkenau, this is a place purely of memorial. This is where all the Jews were sent and where all the Roma and Sinti were sent. And this photograph was taken at the end of the war. The next photograph shows you what it looks like today behind that gateway. This is a vast area, right back to the tree line, that would have been filled with wooden huts, such as you can see in the foreground. But because Auschwitz-Birkenau was not preserved in any way, most of those, until much later, most of those wooden huts just disintegrated, or the wood was stolen as firewood after the war. But what you can see in the distance, quite accidentally, makes for a very poignant, a very sad memorial to all those thousands and thousands and thousands of people who died, who were killed in Auschwitz. Because those uprights you can see in the distance, they are brick chimneys. They are nothing whatsoever to do with the crematoria, but they are brick chimneys. Because inside each hut, you would have two of those chimneys, about that sort of height, and they'd be joined together by a brick tunnel. And there was a grate at either end. And the idea was you'd have fuel that you burn in the grate, and the heat generated would pass along the tunnel, thereby giving warmth to the hut. But of course, they weren't given any fuel. Their lives are meant to be at all comfortable. So as I say, it is a very, very poignant memorial, because there are hundreds of those brick chimneys. Now, when the trains arrived in Auschwitz, and when the people got off the trains, that is the first time they had to go through what was called a selection. And selection always meant life or death. And my mother arrives, and she gets through a selection because she is still considered to be strong enough for work. And this was, despite the fact that she had been somewhat malnourished during the previous 3 years. To give you an idea of my mother's physical strength, when she was 14 years of age, she was school's junior backstroke swimming champion of Czechoslovakia. That gives you an idea of her physical strength. And she always maintained that if this whole experience had to happen to her, she was at the right age, not only physically, but psychologically and emotionally. She was in her mid-20s, she was tough, she was strong. So she gets through a selection, and the people who did, various procedures happened to them. First of all, they were told if they'd managed to bring any luggage with them, to put their suitcases on the ground, to write their names on them, that they would be reunited with them later. Well, of course they weren't. They then were sent into real showers. Well, at this stage, they had absolutely no idea at all that anything other than a real shower existed, i.e. the gas chamber. They then had all their hair shaved. They then were given that sort of striped uniform and a pair of shoes, if they were lucky. And then they were tattooed with a number on their arms. And after that, they were sent into these huts. And on the inside, it looked like this. These huts were incredibly crowded. Some of them before the war would have been stables that might have housed 60 or 70 horses. But at the time that I'm talking about, they housed hundreds and hundreds of people. 500, 800, even up to 1,000 people. And when my mother and her friends arrived in a hut like this, they were so frightened and so bewildered, they just couldn't work out what this place was. And they said to the women there, what happens here, what goes on here, when will we see our families again? And the women actually laughed at them, because they couldn't understand that anybody arriving in Auschwitz would have no idea what went on there. And they said, well, we'll all go up and smoke, and you never see your families again. And in that instant, They knew what went on there. People were given hardly any sustenance on a daily basis. They were given a liquid in the morning, which is called coffee. They were given another liquid in the evening, which is called soup. And if they were very lucky, perhaps they might have been able to dredge up the odd potato peeling from the bottom of the bucket. And they were given one piece of bread. That is all they were given. So an awful lot of people just died of starvation, and you would often wake up in the morning to find corpses on either side. The other thing that happened on a daily basis, apart from the selections, it was at least twice daily, was called the appel. Appel means registration. Sounds like a very mild sort of word. You all go through registration every day at school. What it actually meant was that every day at 4 o'clock in the morning and 6 o'clock in the evening, everybody would have to stand outside their hut to be counted. And if the numbers didn't tally, they would just have to stand there till they did, or until there was some sort of explanation. And my mother said it was very, very hard to stand stock still for hours and hours on end, regardless of the weather. And you tried to keep as low a profile as you could, because you had no idea how the Nazis might react to you if for some reason you drew attention to yourself. And my mother actually fainted several times during these appels, and that could have been very bad news for her. But she was always so relieved to find that when she came round, to find that she was actually being held up by her friends on either side, which meant that she hadn't sunk to the ground, she hadn't drawn attention to herself, and again, she lived to see another day. The next photograph will show you a selection. In the far distance, that long row of people, they are walking to the gas chambers, to their deaths, but they don't know that. In the foreground, the longer row of people are men, the shorter row are women, and they are walking towards a group of Nazi officers where they will be selected for life or for death. And my mother actually remembered one of these selections where Dr. Mengele was presiding. Dr. Mengele was one of the most notorious Nazi officers. He was a medical doctor who actually specialized in appalling experiments upon sets of twins, upon pregnant women, upon babies, upon fetuses. And my mother remembered hearing him say, "Diesmal sehr gutes Material," which means, this time we have very good material in front of us. Not people, units of slave labor. They did not consider the people in front of them as being human beings. Now all the rest of my family, except for my one grandfather at my own parents, so my 3 other grandparents, my 2 aunts, my cousin Peter, and most of the other members of the extended family, they were all sent to Auschwitz a long time before my own parents were. And when they arrived there, none of those initial procedures took place. They were able to keep their clothes, they weren't shaved, they weren't tattooed, and they were sent to what was called a Familienlager. That meant a family camp. All it meant was that 1 or 2 of those huts had families together. And there was just one very cynical reason why, and that was so that they could be forced to write postcards home. And my aunt, the lady wearing the yellow star in that earlier photograph, she wrote this postcard to her cousin, who still happened to be in Prague. And I want you to try to remember the first name of this lady. I'm now going to put up the text of the postcard. Some of you may be able to read it, and I will read you the English translation. It starts off with the words, "Meine Lieben," my dear ones. I'm here with my husband, my sister, and my nephew. All are well and in good health. My husband received a parcel yesterday from our housekeeper, and I would ask you to confirm this to her. Please also thank Gerdy. Could she greet Birza Schmidt for us? I hope you're well and happy. Your parents were very well at the time of our departure. Write soon. Peter looks well. Peter's my 8-year-old cousin. Peter looks well and looks forward to receiving news from you. Greetings and kisses, your Stena. I imagine that you will agree with me that that basically sounds like, having a wonderful time, wish you were here. And my aunt was desperate to get a message out in code. She got the message out, it was understood, it was acted upon. The postcards had to be written in German so the Germans could censor them. In the top left-hand corner you can see the sender's full name, Sidonie Isidore. She'd married that man in the first photograph. Underneath that is her birthday, the 21st of March, 1904. Underneath that it says Birkenau. Does anybody remember the first name of the lady to whom it was sent? Olga. The word Olga does not feature in the postcard. Where the word Olga should be is the word Lechem, which is not German. What language is it? Czech? No, it's not Czech. Yes? You know what it means? By any chance? No, it's okay. Sorry? No, it's got to be logical help. No. No, don't worry. Don't worry. Lechem is the Hebrew word for bread. And my aunt was telling her cousin that they were starving. Her cousin understood. Her cousin sent a parcel, but the contents of it would have been stolen long before it got anywhere near them. And I'm afraid I have to tell you that even before the postcard was sent from Auschwitz to Prague, they were all dead, all of them. Now, because my mother was still strong enough for work, she was sent out of Auschwitz. She was sent to a slave labour camp, to an armaments factory in a place called Freiburg, which is near Dresden in Germany, where she thought she was working on this. And what's this? Come on, what's this? What's it look like? So, yeah, B1. It's a B1. It's the unmanned flying bomb. Here it was nicknamed the Doodle bomb. And when my mother and the other women arrived in the factory, the very first impression they had was one of bedbugs. The place was crawling. On the floor, on the walls, on the ceiling. And they were delighted. Why? Sorry? You were very close. They didn't actually have to eat them, but it meant there was food there, not much, but there was some, and it also meant there was warmth there. And they very quickly ascertained that there were no gas chambers there. After a few days, they weren't quite so pleased when the bugs started to bite them, but after what they had been through in Auschwitz, it was negligible. Unknown to my mother, she was to spend the next 6 months in Freiburg. That is from October of 1944 to the end of March, the beginning of April of 1945. And the end of the war in Europe was the 8th of May. And during those 6 months, she was becoming progressively more and more starved, and more, obviously, pregnant, which was very, very dangerous for her. But fortunately, none of the Germans realized she was pregnant, because had they done so, they might well have sent her back to Auschwitz to be killed. We do know of cases where that did happen. And during the 6 months that my mother was in Freiburg, that is when the Allied bombing raids of Dresden took place. I don't know if you know about the Dresden raids, there's been a lot of controversy about them since the war. But I hope that you will appreciate that in this particular context, I'm talking to you from my mother's very, very personal perspective. And from her perspective, the raids were just fantastic. What happened when the air raids started was the Germans locked all the prisoners in the factory and they went to the air raid shelters. And the prisoners, even though they knew the next one could fall on them and kill a lot of them, nevertheless they were very pleased because they realized it was the Allies, and they hoped and prayed that it wouldn't be too much longer before they were actually rescued. And this is where my father-in-law comes into the story, very, very, very indirectly. And what's the uniform? And what is it? Army, Navy or Air Force?
Air Force.
Air Force. My father-in-law, Kenneth Clarke, he came from the Welsh-Herefordshire border. He was in the RAF. He was a navigator. He was in Bomber Command. And he was on the Dresden raids. And after the war, when he first met my mother, well, a long time after the war, when my husband and I became engaged and when the two families got together, and when he heard my mother tell what had happened to her, he was absolutely devastated at the thought that he could have actually killed her, which he could have done. The next picture is, it's too dark. It's the front cover of his logbook. It reads Royal Air Force Navigators, Air Bombers and Air Gunners, Flying Logbook, Flight Lieutenant Clarke. And the next picture shows a page from his logbook. And you will now see a line highlighted from that page, and it reads, on the 13th of the 2nd, 45, the 13th of February 1945, 1740 hours, 20 to 6 in the evening. Lancaster, that was the aeroplane. And on the right-hand side, you can see the word Dresden. So he really could have killed her, but he didn't. At the end of March, the beginning of April of 1945, this is when the Germans, realizing they were losing the war, this is when they began evacuating the camps. They were trying to empty the camps of living witnesses as to what had been going on inside them. And this is when the notorious death marches happened. My mother wasn't on a death march, but she was put on yet another train. But this time it didn't consist of cattle trucks. This time it consisted of coal wagons, open to the skies and filthy, and would have looked something like this. My mother was on a train like this for 17 days, with no food and hardly any water. And after the war, when similar trains were discovered and opened up, they were discovered to just have piles of corpses in them. And during this 17-day nightmare of a journey, the train was stopped, the doors are opened, the dead bodies thrown out, and a farmer walked by, and he saw my mother. There were over 1,000 women on this train. And he saw my mother, and he had such a shock. She always said that she could never forget the expression on his face. She described herself as looking like a scarcely living, pregnant skeleton. My mother weighed 5 stone, 35 kilograms, and she was 9 months pregnant. And this farmer brought her a glass of milk. But there was a Nazi officer standing near her, and he had a whip. And he raised this whip to shoulder height. He raised it as if to beat my mother if she accepted the glass of milk. But he didn't. He didn't say anything. He lowered his arm, and he let her have the glass of milk. She maintains that saved her life. Who knows? Perhaps it did. And the train went on. And it eventually arrived in this place called Mauthausen. Mauthausen itself is a beautiful village on the banks of the Danube in Austria near Linz. The concentration camp was up a very steep hill behind the village. And when my mother saw the name Mauthausen at the station, she had such a shock. Because as opposed to when she'd arrived in Auschwitz not knowing what that was, this time she knew, because she had heard about this appalling place from very early on in the war. And she said the shock was so great that she always thought that it possibly provoked the onset of her labour. And she started to give birth to me on that pole wagon. She had to climb off the pole wagon unaided. She had to climb onto a cart because the prisoners who were not strong enough to walk up the hill to the camp, they had to get onto a cart, and it was pulled up by others. She had people lying all over her, people with typhus and typhoid fever. And she proceeded to give birth to me. And there was another Nazi officer who saw that she was in the midst of child labour, and he said to her, "Du kannst weiter schreien," which means you can carry on screaming, because presumably she had been. And she always said that she was screaming not only because she was in labour, but because she thought this was her very last minute on this earth. She thought she was about to die. But we both survived the experience. I was born, I didn't move, I didn't breathe. Incredibly, the Germans allowed a doctor to come to my mother, a doctor who was also a prisoner, and presumably they allowed it because they could hear the guns in the distance. And the doctor came and he cut the umbilical cord and he smacked me to make me cry, to make me breathe. And there are 3 reasons why we survived, and the first is a very chilling one. On the 28th of April 1945, the Germans had run out of gas for the gas chamber. My birthday is the 29th. So presumably, had the train arrived on the 26th or 27th, again I wouldn't be here today. The second indirect reason is the fact that on the 30th of April, Hitler committed suicide. And the last and the best reason is the fact that about 4 or 5 days later, the American army liberated the camp. My mother reckoned she wouldn't have lasted much longer. The Americans came, they had food and they had medicine, but you probably know it is very, very dangerous to give starved people food because their bodies just cannot take it. And my mother spoke fluent English, and she tried to tell as many people as possible who didn't what the Americans were saying. And they were saying to eat very, very slowly and very small amounts. But you can imagine, can't you, that if you've been starved for months and years and suddenly you're handed an American chocolate Hershey bar, you tend to scoff a lot. And an awful lot of people at that stage collapsed and died. But one hopes that perhaps some of them, a few of them, might have realised that they were actually free. The main form of torture in Mauthausen was the fact that prisoners had to work all daylight hours in a stone quarry. And those are people on the left-hand side. They are carrying large blocks of stone that they've had to dig out of the quarry. And again, you have to remember, these are not young, strong, able-bodied people. These are prisoners who have been starved and tortured for months and years. And so many of them died or were killed on those steps that the prisoners themselves nicknamed them the Stairway of Death. They are very steep. I have seen them, I've been on them. You've been on them? The next photograph shows you after liberation, when some of the prisoners who were strong enough, they're pulling down a Nazi emblem, the eagle with the swastika underneath. They think I weighed 3 pounds. A 3-pound baby nowadays is put straight into an incubator. There were no incubators. Or perhaps I had the best incubator. My mother just held me all the time. And after about 3 weeks, when she was strong enough to travel, the Americans asked her if she wanted to be repatriated to Prague. She did. And so we were put on yet another train, an ordinary train this time. We arrived back in Prague, it was at night and it was dark. And my mother said that was the worst moment of her 3.5 years incarceration in camps. Because up to that moment she'd never allowed herself to think as to what had probably happened to all the rest of the family. She just never let herself think about it. But you know, arriving at your home station, you wonder if there might be anybody there to meet you. And of course there wasn't. But nevertheless, she still had a vestige of optimism at the back of her mind, and she thought that if any other member of the family had survived, there was a chance that it might be her cousin, the lady who received the postcard. And indeed she had. My aunt had come back from Terezin, the first camp, a few days before we came back from Mauthausen. And my aunt had even heard on the grapevine that my mother had survived, and that incredibly she had a baby. My mother asked somebody to give us some money to go on the tram. We arrived at my aunt's flat, and my mother was a very practical woman, and the first words she said to my aunt were, "We haven't got any lice." Well, we were riddled with lice, and we had scabies, which is named we had. And the second thing she said was, "Please could we stay for a few days to recover?" Well, we actually stayed for 3 years, and that was fantastic, because we had our own family support group. It was a tiny family, because we were almost the only survivors from what had been a very large extended family. And because my mother was given closure quite soon after the end of the war, when she was told of the death of my father, so 3 years later she was able to consider a new life and a new marriage. And this is where my stepfather comes into the story, and for the last time tell me what the uniform is. And what is it? RAF. My stepfather, Karl Bergman, he was also Czech and also Jewish. And like my uncle, he'd managed to escape in 1939. He got to this country, he joined the Air Force. He was too old to be trained as a pilot, but because he spoke languages, he was made an official interpreter. And after the war, he came back to Prague to pick up the pieces of his family, most of whom had also been killed in Auschwitz. And he met my mother, whom he had known as a family friend before the war. And they decided to get married, and they also decided to leave, because this was now 1948, and that is when the communists took over, and they did not want to live under a communist regime. And so we came to this country, and although we came legally, I would like to stress, we might have come as refugees, we might have come as asylum seekers, we might have come as migrants. We arrived in this country. My stepfather got a job quite quickly in South Wales. I think the uniform probably helped. And as a result, I grew up in Cardiff. And guess who? I know I've changed, just slightly. I don't have plaits anymore. Well, I do have the plaits, but they're a different colour. As you can see, this is a very happy picture. We're on our way to my first school prize giving, where my mother shed a lot of tears. Well, all parents and grandparents shed tears at prize givings. But I think she might have cried a bit more because, unknown to her, I was about to receive a prize for reading, and I hadn't spoken a word of English when we first arrived there. And then people say to me, well, what did she look like in more recent times? So when I put up the next photograph, I want you all to tell me, all of you, with one voice, where we are. So where are we? Yes, we're on the lunch night. When the lunch night opened, I asked my mother that year what she would like to do as a birthday treat. She was then 85, and she said, well, everybody's going on this lunch night, I want to go. So we did, and she thoroughly enjoyed it. And this is my mother 10 years later, on her 95th birthday. Not bad, 95. And my last photograph is my 4-generation photograph. I have 2 sons, and they have 3, now 4 children between them. And my mother could never get over the fact that she'd survived her wartime experiences. I'd survived. I had 2 sons, and that she ended her life with 3 great grandchildren. Now that is basically my story, but I want you to bear with me for 1 more minute while I tell you why I tell the story. I tell the story first of all for reasons of commemoration, to remember. To remember all those millions and millions of people who died, who were killed in the Holocaust. And especially all those people, we don't know the numbers, who have never ever had one single person remember them, because all their families were killed and all their communities destroyed. And the only way that people live on is through our remembering of them. The second reason is just to tell you one family story, because as many as there are survivors, and they are a dwindling group nowadays, there are that many different stories, and they're all unique. They may have common elements, but they're all unique. The third reason is to try to enable us all, each and every one of us in this room today, to learn the lessons of the Holocaust. But just think about all the genocide since. Cambodia, Bosnia, Rwanda, Darfur, Syria, Myanmar. And the last reason is related. The last reason is to try to counteract racism and prejudice, any form of racism and prejudice.